So let's make a start. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure to be chairing this webinar, which we're running in partnership with British Future. So when Donald Trump takes office as president for the second time later this month, he'll become leader of a country that some now argue is more politically and ideologically divided than at any point since the American Civil War. In recent decades in particular, US politics has become more about fundamentally conflicting identities and worldviews, organized across party lines, with debates around immigration often core to that divide. So it's a huge honor and pleasure to have one of the key thinkers and voices on how we counter this polarization in Frank Sharry. Frank was an immigration advisor to Kamala Harris's campaign and is founder and former executive director of the immigration reform group, America's Voice. And I won't say much more about Frank's illustrious career or try to preempt his points, except to say that as well as being a key figure in the US discussion, he's also been hugely influential in shaping thinking in the UK on how we combine more control with more compassion, strict limits with wider legal pathways. And I've worked on attitudes to immigration for around 2 decades now, and we continue to do that at the Policy Institute, and Sophia will put some links in the chat for you. And so much of how Frank frames this rings true with where the public in the UK is. So we'll hear first from Frank for around 15 minutes. Then we have a really brilliant panel of respondents. And first we'll have Maria Scesa, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester and has worked extensively in this area. And I think we'll be covering whether the extreme polarization seen in the US could take root in British society. And then we'll have Sunder Katwala, who is Director of British Future, who are an independent, non-partisan think tank who focus on people's hopes and fears around immigration, integration, race, and identity. And Sunder, again, I think will focus on how Britain might chart a different course from America's immigration debate. So 2 really simple topics for each of Maria and Sunder to cover in the 6 or 7 minutes that they all get to respond. So that will leave plenty of time for questions for you. So do think of those as we go through and post them in the Q&A function on Zoom. And then also do upvote the ones that you want asked, as I'll pretty much pick the top ones, as that makes my job really easy. So these are great sessions, but they're only an hour. So we try to stick to that tight hour, so we will have us finished by 1:30. So in that circumstance, we're going to move straight over to Frank. You're very welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much, Bobby, and it's a pleasure to be here with such esteemed colleagues. I'm going to speak to you not as an academic or an expert, but as a practitioner. I joined the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris campaign about a year before Election Day, and I'm going to share some of my experiences and perspectives from that experience. And then, but I think it'll get at some of the issues that we're talking about today, which is how polarized America is, how polarizing immigration is as it's weaponized by populists to gain power, and what it means for the UK as well as the EU as this battle between liberal democracy and autocratic populism becomes fully joined. When I joined the Joe Biden campaign, I'll be honest, I wasn't a huge Joe Biden fan, but I was a huge Donald Trump enemy. And so the idea of that battling against the forces of the liberal populism inspired me to join the campaign with a good man, a pretty decent president, but a very flawed candidate. I joined the policy team. I'm not a campaign operative from way back. I have worked on a few initiative campaigns in America related to immigration, which are a bit of a different beast at the state level in California and Arizona. But I wanted to join the presidential campaign because of the stakes. And I was asked to join the policy team, A, because of my expertise on immigration, and B, because they needed more bodies and minds and hands. And I was the self-declared 27-year-old staffer in a senior citizen's body, a bit of a unicorn with my fellow young, highly educated, highly ambitious staffers, all of whom were hoping to translate a campaign job into a White House job. I had no such ambitions, but enjoyed the spirited work that our team put together. When I first joined the policy team at the Biden campaign, I worked in Wilmington, Delaware, the headquarters, and the job was to convince the American people that Joe Biden had been a very successful president. And I said, okay, that seems like an interesting choice because I'm very taken with the experts who say that campaigns are about the future, not about the past. And here we were trying to prove that Joe Biden had been a successful president in his first 3 years. And we were not only trying to make more accessible his accomplishments, which were formidable, low unemployment, higher wages, huge infrastructure investments, major bipartisan legislation, uh, record investment in climate change, record investment in technology production and chip production. I was really impressed by the Joe Biden presidency as I began to study it and write about it for talking points and speeches and fact sheets, et cetera. But what I found remarkable is that as I learned more about the Biden presidency, kept asking myself, why am I just learning about this? Why am I digging deep into the archives of White House documents and only finding out now the extent to which they're making policy across the board? And I worked on every domestic issue, sometimes foreign policy, but mainly domestic issues. And I was so impressed. And I thought, I mean, I read 3 newspapers a day. I follow, social media closely. I'm politically literate compared to many Americans who are hardly so. And I did not know all this detail and all this depth and breadth. And so that just raises one question, which is why is it that a presidency can be so consequential? I mean, I've always dreamed of a 21st century New Deal that would revive the kind of coalition and investments and changes and progressive changes that FDR brought into being in the 1930s in America. And this was about as close as we've come. It was a very different approach and vibe than, say, Barack Obama, who was far more moderate on his economic policies and much more tepid, quite frankly, on some of the civil rights issues he had to deal with. It was also a different time, but Biden was much more aggressive and yet wasn't getting credit for it. Well, it raises a couple of things. One, it became pretty clear that Biden himself and his administration were pretty terrible at communicating their accomplishments. They preferred being in the back room cutting the deal to going out to actually sell it. And I think there's a lesson for all Democratic elected officials across the world. Doing it is one thing, getting credit for it is another thing. And you have to focus at least as much on the second as the first. And the Biden administration did not. So the campaign was sort of given the task of selling the presidency. And quite frankly, we were talking in facts rather than lived experience. So while the public was concerned with the price of eggs and the price of groceries and the price of housing and the interest rates and the fact that it seemed really hard to get ahead in the economy, we were talking about record employment, inflation down from 9% to 3%, wages growing faster than inflation, investments totaling X number of billions of dollars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, the Biden administration, to its credit, invested more in counties and areas that voted for Trump in 2020 and 2016 than in Democratic counties. It was a real effort to spread the investments across America. Our red and blue is different than yours, as you know, so in red counties, so that people would really feel it. Well, so the administration didn't communicate it. It also I think it's also true that the investments had not really been felt in a big way yet because so many of them are on a 10 to 15-year time horizon. But I also want to bring up the fact that the media ecosystem in America I had to come to appreciate it and appreciate it not like in a good way, but come to realize how strongly the media ecosystem is tilted to uh, the right wing ecosystem. I mean, Fox News is just the beginning of a huge and almost hermetically sealed system of podcasts and websites and talk radio and TV stations and um, validators, so that if you're in the right wing media ecosystem, Joe Biden's a terrible president. Crime is out of control, even though it wasn't. Prices were out of control, even though they were coming down. Investments were not mentioned. The border was the relentless topic, etc. And I saw it from my desk at the campaign. We had all the TV stations up on the wall without sound. But watching Fox News 24/7 is it's quite an experience because it's not balanced. It is simply a propaganda network that is very effective at what they do. And so and what you realize is that for Democrats, they rely on legacy media or the mainstream media, the sort of New York Times, Washington Post, CNN kind of world, um, plus a very small progressive media infrastructure, and they can't compete. They just can't compete. So this is a real structural problem in America that's going to have to be tackled. When I come to the UK, it's a rough and tumble media environment, that's for sure. But I just even just watching this sort of Elon Musk inspired debate over recent days about grooming and so forth, I mean, that he could make it an issue is disturbing. But that the response ended up being a sensible kind of conversation about what is the best way forward and why he is telling lies and why we need to focus on actions that will actually benefit people. That wouldn't, I come from a country where Kamala Harris's rise as a candidate was stopped by a made-up story of Haitian immigrants eating pets in a town called Springfield, Ohio. I mean, how ridiculous can you get? But it worked. It stopped her momentum. It changed the topic. It was a pure distraction technique that worked magnificently. And it wasn't a 3-day story like the Elon Musk intervention. It was a 5-week story. And it totally dominated the media sphere in a way that completely thwarted and stopped Kamala Harris's meteoric rise as a new candidate. So I do think this media ecosystem is something that many Democrats are now talking about as we look to the future. And boy, something's going to have to change. Right. The main conversations are how do you build more of a progressive infrastructure. There's not much hope that legacy media is going to be helpful because that's sort of both sides gotcha kind of stuff that the mainstream media does is just not that interesting or not that helpful. And the people that need to be gotten to in terms of voters don't pay attention to it. And so the question of how to show up in places where low information voters and swing voters show up on podcasts and Manosphere and all these things, Joe Rogan, all that stuff. But it is a real challenge. Is how can Democrats not stay away from the formidable right wing leaning infrastructure and media, but actually engage it? So, and then finally, the Biden campaign that I was working for wanted to focus on Joe Biden as a successful president in terms of jobs and the economy and investments. And the voters wanted to focus on cost of living. They wanted to focus on immigration and the border. And the Biden campaign and presidency didn't want to focus on either of those issues. And so over time, it did. We sounded kind of preachy. We have facts to show you that your lived experience is wrong. Turns out it's not a very powerful persuasion strategy. Believe you me, we've tried it. And so it just felt like we were kind of screaming into a wind tunnel that was coming at us, and we just weren't connecting with people. When Kamala Harris did become candidate, she did make the campaign about the future. immediately and decisively. She had a stump speech ready that was brilliant and inspiring. It was connecting with the American people where they were on the issues they cared about, including cost of living and infrastructure and immigration, rather. It was a very inspiring, hopeful approach, and she really did put rocket fuel in the campaign as a result of her ability to shift from Biden's a good guy and a good president to this is about you and your future. Now she made mistakes. We all know she didn't have an adequate answer for why the positions she had taken when she was running for president in 2019 were so on the left, and the positions she was staking out as a candidate now were so center left center. She never really came up with an adequate explanation for that. She said, "My values haven't changed," it just seems to me she could have done a bit of a better job on. Look, I've been vice president for 4 years. I've traveled the country. I've learned by seeing people in every region, and my views have evolved. But unfortunately, that didn't help her. And of course, probably the bigger issue was that she wasn't able to distinguish herself from Joe Biden enough so that she could escape the headwinds of incumbency that affected so many parties and governments around the world, including the Tories here. She never did that sufficiently. I was asked the other day why I thought that was, and I think it was because they were so close and she was so loyal. I mean, this is like the simplest explanation may be true in this case. It's like, well, what was the calculation? Maybe it wasn't so much calculation. Maybe they should have been more calculated. But she was very, very close to him. They had a very, very tight relationship. And, I think she just didn't want to throw him under the bus when she, as many of us do think, he will be judged as a consequential president. Unfortunately, it may not be for another 20 or 30 years. Let me talk a little bit just about immigration and border security, which is the issue I did focus the most on and is obviously ripe for polarization in America and around the world. You know, Trump as president was he lost the country, most of the country on immigration. He separated families. He went after young immigrants called dreamers in America. His policies were so cruel and so chaotic, and he didn't really handle the border. He claimed he did in retrospect, but what handled the border was his mismanagement of the pandemic. And when human mobility essentially stopped, that included migration from the Americas to the southern border between the US and Mexico. So he had a poor immigration record. And when Biden came in, his views were actually kind of 60-40 favorable with the American people. But there was this huge post-pandemic demand for migration from the Americas. Worth noting that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 8% of the world's population, 28% of the world's pandemic deaths, poor public health infrastructure, lots of people with relatives in the United States who had money to be able to pay for smuggling operations, which is the way you have to make it from Venezuela or Cuba or Haiti or Nicaragua or Ecuador or Mexico. And there was this huge surge. And the asylum system was unable to handle it. The administration didn't know what to do about it. So they muddled through and they didn't want to talk about it. This is what they got horribly wrong. And so instead of leaning in and saying, okay, this is a problem, it's a tough one. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's what we need. Here's what we need from Congress. Here's what we need. We need some patience from the American people. We need millions and billions of dollars from Congress. And we need to reform and resource our system so that we can make it fair, orderly, and humane. They never had a narrative that really tackled the issue that was driving Americans. And this vacated the narrative sphere for the Republicans and Trump to define them. So Democrats we don't know what the hell they're doing. It doesn't make sense to us, but we don't want to touch it. The administration thought every day without a story on immigration was a good day. And Fox News and the right wing ecosystem was 50% of their coverage was about immigration and the border. images of chaos. And it wasn't just incompetence and indifference that they were promoting. They went to conspiracy theories to suggest malice. They called it an invasion. They said it was part of this white supremacist theory of the Great Replacement theory, where the idea is that the establishment, the Democrats, are bringing in people because they want these people to become voters who will vote white people out of power. And that was not just you know, the fever swamps of the right wing. That was mainstream Republican members of Congress standing up in the halls of Congress giving speeches about an invasion that was designed to replace voters. Tucker Carlson made it a huge issue when he still had his Fox News platform. So it was punishing. So by the time the election rolls around, folks are the immigration and border security is the lowest polling issue for the administration, and the administration didn't want to talk about it. The president didn't want to talk about it. Harris came in, she reversed that. She leaned in on it. She made it part of her stump speech. She wanted to pass a bipartisan border bill that Trump had tanked for political purposes, cynical political purposes. She made a major speech on immigration at the border. She said, I'm going to be balanced. I'm for control and compassion. I'm for being tough and being generous. We need expansive legal pathways, as well as making sure that people don't abuse our system at the border, in a way that was very popular with the American people when tested, but not heard. Again, the right wing media ecosystem was saying this is all baloney. They could have done it before. They don't really mean it. And on the left, there was criticism that this was too strong and too tough and not humane enough. And the mainstream media only question was, how come you're only talking about it now? This isn't what you said in 2019. And when the numbers of border arrivals started to come down in a huge way, starting in June of 2024, a remarkable decline. I mean, December 2023, 250,000 border arrivals. People came into the country by crossing the border and saying they wanted to apply for asylum because of the overwhelmed system. They were led into the country and into a system that had backlogs of 7 to 10 years, in which people were eligible for work permits within 6 months, and the rates of asylum approval were less than 20%. So it was a pretty surefire way to, get to the border, apply for asylum, and get in the country. And it caused a tremendous amount of resentment, even among immigrant communities, many of whom were in mixed status families with undocumented loved ones who have been waiting for 15, 20 years for some sort of status. And these new arrivals were being let in with work permits. It caused a huge backlash among Latino voters in places like Las Vegas and Phoenix, battleground states and cities that became, unfortunately, states that Harris lost in the end. So, yeah, so I think it's a cautionary tale. I do think labor has done a better job of leaning into the issue in the campaign. I think they now are faced with the same problem that the Biden administration is faced with, is how to go from muddling through to actually getting it right, particularly this issue of boats, which really just makes voters crazy in a way that's almost irrational. By the time the administration in America got it right, the voters weren't prepared to listen to it. They just, what do you mean you're bringing down the numbers? Why didn't you do it before? I don't believe you. This isn't true. That was the kind of response we were getting. So they finally got the policy right, but they never got the politics right. Just a few comments on going forward. The Democrats are engaged in a huge discussion of what now after this loss, of course. Sort of the outline is more economic populism, maybe a little bit less on identity issues without sacrificing core values, and not enough conversation from my point of view around immigration. Still a hot button topic. A colleague and I wrote a piece in the Atlantic about a way forward, and wow, the left is up in arms. You know, Democrats are like, we don't know what this means for us. I mean, we need a huge rethink and a process to get there. And I just think if we could bring Sunder and labor together over to the United States, they might get it right. But I'm not terribly confident that in the short run we will get it right. But I think by the time the presidential primaries will come around and the congressional elections in 2 years, that the Democrats will have a better balanced approach on control and compassion than they did in the last 4 years. And then, it's on it. I'll just finish on this. Migration and border security in an era of accelerating and increasing global migration is damn hard to get right, to impose some sort of order at your border in a way that also creates political space for more generous legal pathways that are orderly. And that is not only the right message, that is the right governing strategy, but it takes a combination of deft policymaking and deft political skills to be able to communicate what's happening in a way that, too many people in our countries think that illegal immigration sort of starts at our borders, and how come we're not just waving a magic wand and dealing with it? It's hard to deal with, and it's essential that we get it right. So to the extent that labor can get it right, I think it'll be a model both for us in the United States and perhaps others in Europe, so that we can actually say, you know what, the center left can manage migration in a way that's both fair and orderly, that's both humane and controlled. And if we do get that right, it'll be a huge breakthrough. And if we don't get that right, I'm afraid the right-wing populists will continue to weaponize it in a way that advances their quest for power. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Frank. It's so brilliant to get that direct insight from the campaign. I'm going to move straight on to Maria just to get your reflections.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frank. This was so very interesting. And I think so important for the UK to remember the context of what you call this right-wing weaponization of this issue. Because one of the really important things to remember about immigration is that it never has been popular, it never will be popular, and there will always be this division in a society between people who are fine with it and think it might be good for economy, they don't feel affected by it, and people who will worry about it. And these people, when we think about kind of surveys over time, we think that there's a very similar proportion of people who just feel worried about immigration and don't love it throughout, decades that we have had survey research. And what really makes a difference is whether this worry becomes politically salient. So it becomes important in political debates. And without that kind of vehicle to become a political issue, these worries will just fester and they will not become politically powerful the way that we have seen them become politically powerful in the British politics just in the run-up to Brexit. And arguably, as I wrote with my lovely co-author Rob Ford in our book Brexitland, basically causing Brexit. But they will always be there. And in our book, we do have this phenomenal example that we found in really old sociological literature. It's a book from 1960s about this little town in Oxfordshire called Banbury. And a lot of this book is called Tradition and Change. And it is talking about how this little town has been sent completely crazy by immigrants. And the immigration is changing the politics, the sociology, the economics. And of course, the big twist that we reveal in our book, reminding people of it, is that Oxfordshire town is sent into this frenzy by immigration from Yorkshire. So this is English, fellow Englishmen coming with a different accent, with their old ways and different accents, and looking and smelling different and cooking unreasonable food, right? So these are the kinds of stories that we hear again and again and again about pretty much any immigration from any source. And we know over time, those old immigrants that sent us into frenzy then become part of our societies, and we learn to accept them and we learn to love their food, and we kind of intermarry and make friends and move on. But then there will always be those new immigrants from those new areas, and often nowadays, as Frank said, new paths of immigration. So we do have now a lot more attention to how people arrive. Are they legal? Are they illegal? In this kind of parlance of populism, mobilizers of this issue. So really, when we think about will polarization happen around this issue of immigration, we are not actually talking about society. We are actually talking about politics and how the society will fall on either side and whether it will be something they will vote on really does depend on what the politicians do and those political entrepreneurs in, as actually Frank also mentioned quite rightly, in this really fragmented media context where most people are getting their news from YouTube as opposed to the BBC, like was our traditional British way. This is really worrying because those people are talking up those worries and they are whipping that frenzy about immigration, even though, you know, we can argue about positives and good things about immigration and ways in which we need one, in fact, to fuel growth, to fuel this supposed boost in building houses, etc. The truth is that nobody will believe centre left on immigration. I am absolutely convinced of this now, that one of the things that we have seen in America when Kamala Harris did try to talk about it, did try to pass on this message of, I will be firm, you know, firm and fair. We have heard that before in UK from Tony Blair in 1997 as well. And we have, you know, Labour has tried this message many times before. The truth is, because the centre left has this very strong internal element that actually thinks it's already racist to oppose it. It's already too woke, too intolerant to not go all the way to say, well, actually, immigrants should be welcomed. We should not be bigoted in opposing immigration, using very kind of strong moral language around being anti-immigration and anti-immigrant. All of this, the voters that we need to persuade, or they need to persuade the centre left, are hearing it. So they will never be fooled by a centre left person coming out and saying, I'll be firm on immigration, because they can hear all the voices in the background of that person screaming at them. And so this cross pressure, I would say, creates this impossible situation for the centre left. And in fact, what really needs to happen is that we need to do more work around this, around believing, creating a believable message, and on all sorts of political fronts. And I think one of the, again, really interesting parallels with Kamala Harris here is that talking to voters about immigration is the beginning. And talking honestly about your values and about where you might disagree with the critics from the same political spectrum that you are on, I think is very important. Otherwise, we will never see any hope. But of course, we have also some examples of that happening quite successfully in the UK. And again, in the book with Rob Ford, we have taken an example of Scotland, where the voters are pretty much the same. We have very similar demographics. We have similar kind of divides in terms of social divides on similar issues. People don't love immigration there either. However, the public narrative around immigration is so different, and that is and has been led from the front, from the SNP, not marrying the independence message and policy kind of aims with anti-immigration and nationalistic, kind of exclusively nationalistic message, but instead going for civic nationalism, which is welcoming and accepting of immigration. And of course, we know Scotland has extended the franchise in their local elections as well to immigrants, creating that positive story and actually creating voters who will then vote for them in the future as well. So I would say, not stealing any of Sunder's thunder here, in terms of the future pathways that Britain really should remember, is that they are not America. And even though I do think there is a danger that Trump and the kind of band of rich right-wing populists around Trump will fuel that media environment in Britain as well. They will try to whip that YouTube channels, podcasts, and all of that that negative framing around immigration, trying to create this kind of polarization. We do have a different country with different systems, with recent positive examples. And of course, we are much more fragmented in terms of our parties. And so I think that actually might be also a winning formula for Britain, that there isn't such a, it's either Republicans or Democrats here. People have been picking more nuanced options, and they will be allowed to, if anything, more in the future, in my view. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Maria. I'm going to pass on straight to Sunder, just with a quick reminder to people to have a look at the Q&A, add your own question or upvote. But first, Sunder.
Great. Thanks very much, Bobby. It's great to be here with you. Britain isn't America. Hopeful message there. Trump to the sequel. We didn't want to see this movie again. We didn't buy a ticket. We didn't vote for it. A quarter of Britain, is happy that Donald Trump's in, and they're free speech warriors of a particular kind. Half of Nigel Farage's voters are happy to see Donald Trump in. Actually, others are not. So we're not America, and I've always felt that, and I'm an optimist about Britain. And I just feel a bit wobblier about that this month, because we woke up on New Year's Day and Elon Musk has shrunk the Atlantic because and we don't like Elon Musk either, whatever he's done with his cars and his rockets. Messed up Twitter before he endorsed Trump, before he endorsed Tommy Robinson. So no thank you, Elon. And yet we're having the debate he wanted us to have. And we've probably learned more about Elon Musk and than we have about Tommy Robinson, but actually, that we haven't got the same ecosystem, etc. We have got more fragmentation, and so we're not America, but that will be tested as never before in the next 4 years. And so we can't just cross our fingers and say we're not America. There are good ways about not being America. Some of the things that totally divide America: should you have publicly funded healthcare or not? I mean, that's our national religion, the NHS. And abortion is settled, and guns. We had a school shooting and we banned the guns, and we're pleased we did it, and we're keeping that. And Elon Musk says we should arm the people he's tweeting stuff at. No thanks, Elon. So we're not America, but this issue of immigration does translate across. It's different. It's a different context. If we don't get this one right, this is what populism is about. Not just immigration and identity, immigration and race, immigration and integration, whatever's in people's heads, votes, numbers. And so if we don't get this one right, we'll be in trouble. So I think lesson number one that Frank gives us, and the Harris campaign ends up exactly where the Remain campaign ended up. In 2016. Well, if you haven't been making the case for Europe for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you haven't been making the case for, can't start now. Just change the subject. I hope they don't notice you won't talk about the thing. They won't talk about, you cannot win by changing the subject and not talking about it. Of course, you're in the depths of a campaign, you've got nothing to say. You've got a net migration target and the freedom of movement in Europe, and they're incompatible. Then it's a problem to end up on a message you can't sell. But then if you lean out, you will get totally defined. You will be defined as the caricature that your opponents say as you're the liberal elite. You like it. You can't even turn up and defend it. So if you don't define yourself, you will get defined. So lean in. Don't lean out, I think, is a message. We've got lots of advice on narrative and messages. There are pressures and gains of immigration. If we manage the pressures well, we can keep the gains. It's good for the health service. Let's do more about housing, control and compassion. If we let it become, are you team control or do you get the T-shirt for team compassion? We know lots of the people who buy the T-shirt for team compassion in the faith groups, in the student societies, in the big cities. Some people with migrant heritage will. Some people with migrant heritage will be on the opposite side of the argument, as loud as possible to prove which team they're on. But it will be a no-score draw at best. And I wonder if the real lesson of Trump versus Harris and what happened to Australia is it won't even be a no-score draw in overtime. We will lose the match. If we force people to choose, most people are balancers, but forced to choose. They don't want Rwanda and it's cruel and it doesn't work, but that's partly because it doesn't work, as well as because it's cruel. We force people to choose, and we're labelled as chaos and no control and open borders. At least some of our friends will get in. Actually, we end up losing, even though it would be a no-score draw. So while Maria's saying, you wouldn't be trusted if it's inauthentic. People on the left are going to like immigration. Some of us are children of migrants. My dad's Indian, my mum's Irish. I came here, I'm part of it now, so I can be a bouncing voice. So, but it's no good having the narrative right if you don't get the policy right as well. So net migration, 700,000, pretty high. When it halves this year, do you keep saying it's high and have an auction? Is it net 100? Is it net zero? Or do you start trusting the public and saying, we know you think it's pressure on housing. We know you think it's good for the NHS. We know you think universities are good if we manage it well. Let's be more open with it. Let's get out of this idea of ducking away. The public know there are trade-offs, dilemmas of control. We got control back when we increased immigration for good reasons. Ukraine, Hong Kongers, students, and so on. But the number was very high. We didn't have the conversation. And the same on asylum, except you've got to make it work. And so unilateralism can't do it. Pass laws saying you can't come on a boat and I'll deport you, and I'll, deport you all to Rwanda, but I won't. You won't be credible. So there's always a danger. The populist wing is insatiable. Most people are balancers. The balancers see both sides, but they've got to hear us say both sides, and then we can hear all of the voices. People laugh sometimes when we talk about legitimate concerns. They think it's become code for pandering. Legitimate concerns, yes. Illegitimate concerns, no. You can have a managed asylum system. You can't protest outside hotels and try to burn them down. We're against racism, and we're for managed immigration, and we're for the integration that makes us all British together. If we can say that, it will be good. We've got to do it as well as say it, for it to command the confidence that in a changing world, we can keep the salience down, not have it overwhelm us and lead to a fragmented populist election in which maybe very few people vote, five-way split, and you're playing Russian roulette with who the government is.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sunder. I'm going to, as I get my questions together, just any immediate reflections on that, Frank, to Maria and Sunder.
Brilliant. I wish the level of discussion in America was the level of discussion. You may think it's at a rather base level, but when you're debating whether there's an intentional policy of Democrats to replace white people with brown people in America, and that's taken seriously by half the country, we're in real trouble. So I will say this, in America, More in Common just did a very extensive post-election poll along with others. Most Americans, most Trumpers are balancers. Most want orderly legal immigration and order at the border. And in fact, the more order at the border you have, the more support there is for higher levels of orderly immigration. And I just think that those of us who care deeply about refugee protection and asylum are going to have to figure out, how can we have orderly systems that protect refugees that are within the domestic and international laws as that we've all signed on to and created, and do it in a way that's politically sustainable. I think that's the real challenge for us going forward. If we can get that right, where people who are deserving of refugee protection, either through orderly programs from overseas or through efficient systems at points of entry that get away from the sort of, buses to New York and the hotel controversies in the UK. I do think that that's going to be a real key to being able to, and it's not some political trade-off. It's they actually work together. The way we say it in America is that we're a nation of immigrants and we're a nation of laws, and the best way to be either is to be both. They actually work together in a synergistic fashion if we can get it right.
Really good, really good. So we've got some clear top questions from people, and I'm actually going to work through them. And it does come to you first, Frank, I think, on this first one, which is a future view. So what extent do you think that American politics is going to continue to polarize beyond Trump, who has only got this term ahead of him? What does the future beyond that look like, which I guess is difficult when we can't really see what's going to happen even in the next 4 years?
Well, we are going to have an even more serious stress test of our democratic institutions in the next 4 years. All to play for. Nothing is utterly predictable, especially Trump. But I think really the question is, do we become more like Hungary or do we become more like Poland? There's no doubt that the amount of power that Trump and his party has accumulated with a stacked Supreme Court, with a congressional majority having won the popular vote, that he's going to try to turn the government workers into loyalists. He's going to try to pick fights with Democratic strongholds in a way. Like it's going to be, wow. He's going to use the once independent Department of Justice to try to prosecute and intimidate his political rivals. So and he's going to try to deport millions of immigrants who are deeply rooted in American society. The majority of Americans saying, let's give them a path to legal status, residency, and citizenship, not deportation. So I do think we're going to have a huge stress test. I do think it's mainly around Trump. I don't think he's replicable, but can he institutionalize enough of the and degrade further our institutions so that a successor would have the tools to be able to continue much of what he started? Of course, I'm hopeful. I mean, God, last thing we give up is hope. That in 2 years the Democrats will take back the House of Representatives, and in 4 years they'll take back the White House, but maybe more like Poland than Hungary. It's not going to be easy to undo the damage that's going to be done in the next few years. So it's going to be a long twilight battle. And of course, there's always a chance that, I mean, look, I fully expect Trump to try to figure, if he's alive, to try to figure out how he can get a third term. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. He talks about it all the time. You think that he's going to be, let's observe the norms and protocols and laws of the United States. He doesn't care. And could he get the Supreme Court to rule that, yeah, you were kind of robbed of that second term in 2020? So, I mean, so we are in the twilight zone of democracy in America. Let's hope that we can resist enough. And I think the Democrats are going to be much smarter about how they resist this time. We used to go nuts every time he opened his mouth. We thought we just had to discredit him with everything he said and everything he did, and then there'd be a V-shaped political recovery. I don't think there's going to be a V-shape after this election. God, as disheartening and as heartbreaking as it is, there's still a hope that the country can survive Trump, but it's going to be a close call.
And Maria and Sunder, any reflections on that direct question, or from a UK context as well? So this does feel like a crucial period, this parliamentary term that we've got here for addressing some of these things for our own UK future.
I think limiting the damage of Trump and working out what you do afterwards will be an international question as well as a domestic question. I mean, in America, you might see Trump in a sort of Putin-Medvedev situation where someone else is on the ballot paper, but everyone knows it's still Trump. But he's going to do enormous damage to the multilateral system where he can. And actually, that's where Keir Starmer and the next German chancellor, they have to defend the multilateral system and make it work by someone who wants to wreck it to show that it doesn't work so you can scrap it. So I think Trump and Orban are very much the outriders in the international system, but people are very caught in the middle, and the more times you stress test it in that way, the more degraded it gets and the less likely it is to have the confidence of the people you need, because multilateralism has to be part of the solution, not the thing that says no to the things that you might do to get it right.
Maria?
I really, as a Polish person, I feel like I need to pick up that kind of, are you going to be Poland? Are you going to be Hungary? And I must say that my first initial response was like, if Poland can be Poland, then the United States can definitely be Poland. I mean, when you try to remember how new Polish democracy is by comparison, and actually, I think because it is a system that is that allows more fragmentation. I mean, it didn't pan out in the end to be as fragmented as it could have been. But the truth is that the recovery, the kind of democratic mobilization to throw out the previous government, I would say was extremely surprising. However, the really thing that has saved us is the difficulty of changing the constitution. And I think that what the US has in its favor, that actually it is not easy to change the constitution, certainly not with the kind of majorities that we are looking at now. And of course, in the midterms, they might change again. So there's a very short period of time, hopefully with a smallish majority, and I think that is very hopeful that it will render Trump less effective than Orban was in Hungary.
Great, thank you, Maria. So I'm gonna try to link two questions in a similar space here. One is the most upvoted, and which asks, it seems that in some ways voters aren't convinced by the abstract high employment, low inflation, etc., but by their own lived experience of specific financial struggles. But when it comes to immigration, they're happy to accept a fiction over reality, and why the difference. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. And then it seems that it's a bit related to perception reality point generally, and how you communicate that. There's another question from Suzanne McGregor, who says, will rational technocratic communication always lose out against sexy sensationalism? How do we present evidence in a way to get that message across? Frank, do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I'm in the camp that thinks that Democrats need to speak like ordinary people rather than college professors. No offense to the college professors who I rely on for the brilliance that informs so much of what we do. But when you get in front of the public, I mean, Democrats have a difficult time not talking down to people and basically saying, you dummies, how come you don't get it? Rather than, we get you. Now, again, Harris came in, and I thought the reason that she did so well with all of the deficits of incumbency and high inflation and low poll ratings and Joe Biden staying on too long, et cetera, she made cost of living an issue. She made housing an issue. She came up with specific platforms on costs, on housing, on small business formation, on healthcare, on home care. I mean, I was part of the policy team that generated that stuff, and it was amazing to see how and she made huge progress in the polling. She didn't win on the macroeconomic who's better for the economy. She closed somewhat on that. But on who's better for the middle class, who's going to tax the wealthy, who cares more about the cost of living for you, like that, she made huge change. So, and then in the battleground states where the campaign made huge investments, I hope I don't sound too defensive. I'm just trying to explain that the campaign actually did succeed in the places where it put most of its resources to in the 107 days that she was a candidate. So I do think that there's a way to talk about what may be considered rational and technocratic issues in a way that is what everyday Americans how they talk, and not inauthentically, but authentically. And I'm not going to give up on truth versus fiction in the political space, because I think once we do that, then we're really in free fall. So, and yeah, we have to communicate these facts better. Look, I mean, immigration is a hard thing to communicate about rationally, because people, it gets at tribalism. Maria was saying it's never really been that popular. It gets at people's tribal, like, hey, there's us and then there's them, and thems are coming, and maybe they're trying to take what's us. I get all that, but there is a way to manage it, to talk about it, and to, more importantly, govern it that takes into account the equities and the factors that do it. Look, we're at the beginning of how Western governments are going to be dealing with accelerating global migration. If this was industrialization, we're in the 1880s. We're trying to figure out what the next 60 years is going to look like. And I think over time, it's going to be what can be done to reduce out-migration pressures in a thoughtful, long-term way. What could be done to have more orderly legal flows with responsibility sharing among countries that can? What about integration and supporting local communities that are feeling impacts? What about workers here that feel disadvantaged? These are all legitimate questions that are matters for smart policymaking, and in many respects are being done in various ways and in various countries. So I don't think it's impossible. The part that gets me crazy is that it's impossible to manage. It's impossible to do right. We can do much better. It's not about getting it done perfectly. It's about getting it done well, and that's why I'm really I'm hopeful that the Labor government has a few years to do it better, and to maybe do it better than anyone else is doing it. And I think that would be a real advance in the ability of the center holding in Western liberal democracy saying, yeah, migration is a real thing, and it's a challenge. We can't let everybody in. We can't be naive about this, but we don't have to We don't have to mimic our slogans, swilling right-wing friends. We can actually manage this in a way that comports with our interests and our values. I don't think that's impossible. I think that's the job.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank, and great to have that hopeful perspective. And Maria.
Just very quickly on that question about why is it that people are willing to believe fiction on immigration. There actually is quite a lot of research, not mine at all, from kind of political psychologists about this, who argue that this is because people don't think rationally about those things. They feel a sense of threat from others and from their it's almost like a primeval group thing, but from when we lived in smaller groups and we felt under attack from potential attack from strangers. And so every time we talk about immigration, and this is why we call it identity politics, because this raises a threat and a response to something that is about us and who we are, and we feel a need to defend it. Whereas when people talk about economy and when they choose how to vote based on economy, they do engage in just rational thinking about it. They weigh up balances and positives and negatives, etc. So they are very different kind of brain systems that get involved in the thinking about those two different issues.
Yeah, really good, important point that we've looked at a lot as well in terms of our work on that distinction between perception and reality, but how it's an emotional response as much as a considered rational response. Sunder.
Yeah, and one response actually would be to make immigration policy more rational and more emotional in different spheres. So I would make it more rational. Should it be net zero, net 100, and so on, by having a thing that looked like the budget, having a thing that looked like the comprehensive spending review, and saying to people, well, what do you want to about nurses? What do you want to about social care? So that when someone says, well, why don't we abolish taxation? You say, well, do you want to abolish the spending as well? And so on. So we don't have that on, but that would be rational. And that would work in some ways. But if we only just talk broadsheet to graduates and say, and this is Maria's work's very good on this in Breaks the Land, you can win the referendum with all the people who've got a university degree. Well, that will be like lots of 25% of people, but you still have to find out how to communicate. More emotional, because they will never be us. They're bad for us. They're too many of us. They why I don't get heard. If you respond with, well, they are good for us. Look at the net fiscal contribution. Think about the better food. And so that's still a them and us story. And so the emotional story is, how do people become us? And has this country been not handled it well? The government's never got it correct. Has this country been quite good that people can become us? People like Maria Scesa and Sunder Katwala can make a contribution, and their kids are as much us as everybody else. We believe that. That's not a fairy tale. That's a reality. But we've got to handle it well. In the universities, in the housing policies, and so on. So I think go for the emotional thing underpinning it and have a rational policy alongside.
Brilliant. And what a great way. Frank,
can I add it's the polling on this, and the experience is very clear in the UK, but I'll just speak about America. Americans are not anti-immigrant, generally. They're anti-chaos. They want order. They want order and immigrants by a majority. And that's something that people, what? Aren't they, like, if they voted on immigration in this election, aren't they anti-immigrant, xenophobic? No. They were just angry about the fact that the government wasn't minding the store and seemed indifferent and incompetent. And by the time they got it right, they didn't believe them. So yeah, there's a cautionary tale there, but there's also, I think, a lot of solid ground to build from in terms of our societies and how they view these issues if we get the governance and the narrative right.
Right. Excellent. And again, a really hopeful way to end this. We are going to have to call it to a close. Thank you, everyone, for their questions, for your questions. They're really great ones in there. Sorry we couldn't get to more, but that was an excellent discussion. Before I do final thanks to people, just to flag that this is the first of two events that we're doing around the second presidency of Donald Trump. This has been broadly on cultural issues, the kind of cultural axis. The next one's more about economic, more looking at the economic drivers behind this, and where we'll look at the role of extreme wealth inequality in fueling populism in different countries around the world as part of a series of events that we're doing with the Fairness Foundation. Then this one with Liam Byrne MP and a brilliant panel. So info in the chat on that. Do sign up to this, to that next in this Donald Trump series. So it's just left me to say finally thank you to all of you for coming, to the Policy Institute and British Future teams for putting this together, to our panel of Maria and Sunder, and then of course most of all thanks to Frank. Really brilliant to hear from you. Thank you all.